NASA's rockets have long dominated the skies, carrying humanity's dreams into orbit. SpaceX's reusable rockets made space travel cheaper, faster, and more frequent, changing the rules of the game. For decades, America has been the global face of space exploration, setting the pace for other nations to follow. The world watched as SpaceX's Falcon 9 landed perfectly on a drone ship, proving that innovation could rewrite history. But while the West celebrated its milestones, a quiet revolution was brewing elsewhere. Africa, often overlooked in global space conversations, was quietly preparing its own bold entry into the cosmos. And in 2025, that vision finally materialized with the construction of Africa's first independent spaceport. This announcement sent shockwaves through Washington, leaving officials scrambling to understand how Africa achieved it. Because for the first time, the global balance of power in space was no longer one-sided. Africa was stepping onto the launch pad, and the United States wasn't ready for it. This spaceport wasn't just another building. It was a declaration of independence from decades of technological dependency. The facility symbolized a continent rising, using its own resources, scientists, and visionaries to lead the next space race. NASA insiders began warning about what they called the African space surprise. Reports leaked that African engineers had leapfrogged traditional barriers by using new forms of self-powered technology. Instead of copying Western rocket models, Africa was designing unique launch systems rooted in its own innovations. The United States, which had long treated Africa as a consumer of space technology, suddenly realized it had a rival. Panic spread through policy circles as analysts predicted Africa's entry into space would disrupt satellite markets. The Pentagon raised alarms about Africa potentially hosting independent military and commercial launches outside U.S. control. For Africa, though, this was never just about power. It was about pride and opportunity. Generations who once saw space as distant now had their own gateway to the stars. The African Union declared that the spaceport would be a hub for collaboration, not domination. But behind the celebration, global competitors quietly understood the implications. A continent rich in minerals like cobalt, platinum, and lithium was now building rockets to use them. And unlike other regions, Africa wasn't tied down by outdated infrastructure or heavy bureaucracy. Its space industry could grow faster, cleaner, and more adaptive than the legacy systems of the West. American officials couldn't believe how quickly the project had moved from concept to reality. Construction teams used modular, rapid-build methods, completing the core launch pad in record time. The design wasn't modeled after Cape Canaveral or Baikonur, or it was something new entirely. Engineers incorporated renewable energy systems to power the facility, making it largely self-sufficient. Solar arrays stretched across the desert, generating enough electricity to support round-the-clock operations. Water recycling systems ensured that even in dry regions, launches wouldn't harm local ecosystems. The symbolism was powerful. Africa was building a space future rooted in sustainability. And this made the U.S. nervous because it represented more than just competition. It represented a different vision of space exploration, one that didn't rely on endless spending or fossil fuels. The first public unveiling of the spaceport drew massive global attention. Drones captured sweeping aerial shots of the launch towers rising above the African landscape. Crowds cheered as African astronauts, scientists, and engineers took the stage to announce their mission. This wasn't a borrowed dream, it was Africa's own. The opening ceremony highlighted partnerships between universities, startups, and governments across the continent. African space agencies that had once worked in isolation were now uniting under a common goal, and that unity was perhaps the most dangerous thing for U.S. dominance, because Washington had always counted on Africa being fragmented, never moving as one. But the spaceport showed a new Africa, cohesive, ambitious, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. As the first rocket rolled to the launch pad, global news channels cut live to the event. Anchors compared it to the space race of the 1960s, except this time Africa was in the spotlight. The rocket bore the flags of multiple African nations, symbolizing collective ownership. It wasn't just one country's victory. It was a continental breakthrough. Inside the control center, young engineers monitored systems with calm precision. Many had been trained locally, breaking the stereotype that African talent had to leave for opportunities abroad. This was homegrown expertise, nurtured on African soil, now guiding rockets toward orbit. The first test launch was scheduled to carry a small satellite into low Earth orbit. But the payload wasn't ordinary. It was Africa's first self-powered communication satellite. The satellite was designed to operate without reliance on traditional ground-based power systems. This shocked American analysts, who realized Africa wasn't just entering space, it was rewriting the rules. When the rocket engines ignited, a roar shook the desert floor. Flames lit the sky as the rocket lifted off, leaving a trail of fire behind it. Millions watched online, cheering as Africa achieved what few thought possible. The satellite successfully deployed, marking the beginning of a new chapter in global space exploration. The African Union declared the mission a success and vowed to expand launches rapidly. Within weeks, contracts poured in from countries eager to use Africa's cheaper and more sustainable launch services. Private companies from Asia and Latin America signed agreements, bypassing traditional U.S. and European launch providers. This cut deep into America's market dominance, fueling panic among policymakers. Congress began holding emergency hearings on how the U.S. should respond. Some called for sanctions, fearing Africa would gain too much influence in global satellite communications. Others argued the U.S. should seek partnerships, but pride made cooperation difficult. Meanwhile, Africa continued to advance, announcing plans for lunar exploration within the decade. The spaceport was already expanding with new research labs, astronaut training facilities, and manufacturing hubs. African universities began offering advanced space science programs, training the next generation of innovators. Scholarships kept talent at home, reducing the brain drain that had plagued the continent for years. The narrative began to shift. No longer was Africa seen as the follower. Now it was the pioneer, showing the world a new way forward. And that terrified Washington more than anything else. Because once Africa proved it could lead in space, it would inspire similar revolutions in other fields. Energy, medicine, transportation, all could follow the same path of independence. The U.S. media began framing the development as a Sputnik moment for America. Just like in the Cold War, America faced a rival advancing faster than expected. But this time, the rival wasn't the Soviet Union, it was Africa. And unlike past competitors, Africa had an abundance of critical resources that America desperately needed. Cobalt for batteries, platinum for fuel cells, rare earth metals for satellites, all were abundant on African soil. Now that Africa had its own spaceport, it could launch satellites to monitor and control its resources. This meant foreign corporations could no longer exploit Africa without oversight. The balance of power in technology and economics was shifting permanently. African leaders framed the spaceport as a beacon of sovereignty. It was proof that Africa could rise on its own terms without begging for aid or permission. Youth across the continent celebrated, seeing futures once unimaginable now within reach. The dream of becoming an astronaut, a scientist, or a space engineer was no longer fantasy. It was a career path rooted in African soil and African ambition. Documentaries and films began highlighting the story of how Africa stunned the world. The narrative of poverty and dependency was being rewritten into one of innovation and leadership. And while America scrambled to catch up, Africa marched confidently into the future. Because the spaceport wasn't the end of the journey, it was the beginning. Plans were already underway for space-based solar power stations to beam energy back to Earth. Engineers proposed building orbital platforms for research, communications, and even interplanetary missions. Africa's trajectory was clear. It wasn't just entering space, it was aiming for the stars. And the world, especially the United States, could no longer ignore it. For the first time in history, Africa was not the passenger but the pilot. It was Africa's rocket engines that thundered into the sky, Africa's satellites orbiting the Earth, and Africa's vision lighting the future. The age of African space exploration had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again.